Hello, my name is Seraphina, and I never imagined I would be writing this for you. My entire life was dedicated to being a nun, a life of faith, prayer, and service. I had never questioned my purpose, nor had I ever envisioned a path beyond the one I walked daily. But everything changed the day I died, at least according to the doctors. I remember the exact moment my soul left my body. What followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced or even imagined. I encountered Jesus, and his revelations profoundly affected me. I now understand things about the future, things I must share with you. The world is moving toward a time when survival without the mark will become nearly impossible. I'm telling you this because time is running out. It all began on a cold, rainy morning. The morning my body betrayed me for the first time. For days, I had felt weak, but I ignored it. After all, I had always lived a simple life, free from indulgence, focused only on prayer and service to the poor. But that morning, something felt different. I awoke with a heaviness in my chest, an unbearable weight that made each breath a struggle. My hands trembled as I reached for a glass of water. Before I could drink it, the world around me blurred. My legs buckled beneath me, and in an instant, everything went dark. I remember lying there in the darkness, barely conscious. I heard distant voices, muffled and distorted, as if I was underwater. My heart pounded loudly in my ears. Then, suddenly, a strange calmness washed over me. It wasn't fear that consumed me. It was peace. And that was when I realized something shocking. I was outside my body. I could see myself lying motionless on the cold tiled floor. My skin was pale, almost lifeless, yet I was still thinking, still aware. I wanted to move, but my body no longer responded. And then, before I could process what was happening, I felt it. A force, gentle yet impossibly strong, pulling me upward. It wasn't like being lifted. It was as if my very essence was being drawn towards something beyond the physical world. The ceiling of my small room didn't stop me. I passed right through it, as though it weren't even there. I looked down and saw the world fading beneath me. The streets, the buildings, everything I had ever known was dissolving into darkness. And then I heard something. At first it was a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, clearer. A voice called my name. I tried to answer, but no words came out. Strangely, I wasn't afraid. Not yet. Something deep within me knew that my journey was only beginning. As I drifted higher, I understood what it truly meant to be weightless. There was no pain, no sensation, only awareness. I glanced down once more and saw my lifeless form sprawled on the ground. The door to my room had swung open, and a neighbor stood there, shouting for help. I knew I should have felt something, panic, desperation, but instead there was only a strange detachment. It was as though I were watching someone else's life, a scene unfolding before me that no longer belonged to me. I turned away from my body, and instantly I felt it again. The pull. Something was drawing me toward another place. At first, I resisted, wanting to stay, but the force became stronger, undeniable. Before I could comprehend what was happening, I was moving. Darkness surrounded me, but it was not emptiness. It was alive. I could hear whispering not from one voice, but from many. Some whispers carried sorrow, filled with despair, while others brimmed with anger. A deep, unsettling dread crept over me. I attempted to turn back, to resist whatever was pulling me deeper, but I had no control. Then, in the distance, I saw it, a light. faint at first, flickering against the darkness. But as it grew closer, the voices around me began to fade. The light became brighter, warmer. I felt it rush over me like a wave, washing away my fear. And in that moment, I understood. I was not alone. The powerful force was getting closer. I knew deep down that this was not my place. Yet, the more I was drawn into the unknown, the harder it became to resist. The warmth I had felt moments before had vanished, replaced by a suffocating darkness. I was no longer floating. I was falling. The air around me grew heavy, pressing against me from all sides, as though it were trying to smother me. I couldn't see where I was going, but I could hear them. The whispers returned. They were louder this time, overlapping, surrounding me from every direction. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel their meaning: regret, suffering, and despair. An overwhelming sense of dread gripped me. I tried to cry out, to ask what was happening, but my voice did not exist in this place. I had no mouth, no hands, no body, only awareness and fear. Was this hell? Was I being judged? Beyond the darkness, something took shape in the distance. At first, it was nothing more than a faint outline, but as it drew closer, I saw it, a tall silhouette, unlike anything I had ever seen before. It wasn't a man or a woman, yet it shimmered faintly, as if made of something beyond light. The moment it approached, the whispers stopped. A silence heavier than the air itself fell upon me. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze pierce through me, reading every part of me. Without a word, it raised a hand, and in an instant, my fall ceased. The air around me grew still. The suffocating darkness receded, and I found myself standing on solid ground that had not been there before. The figure lifted its hand once more and pointed into the distance. Another light appeared, but this time it wasn't just light. It was someone. And as the figure drew closer, I recognized him immediately. It was him. I knew everything about him the moment I saw him. There was no need for an introduction. No words had to be spoken. Jesus didn't have to tell me who he was. His mere presence overwhelmed me, filling me with emotions beyond explanation. My eyes met his, and in that gaze, I saw everything: love, sorrow, and something else. A warning. Jesus raised his hand, and at that moment, the darkness completely vanished. In its place was an endless, vast landscape. It was neither heaven nor earth. It was somewhere in between. Countless souls wandered before me. Some appeared lost, confused, searching for something they could not find. Others knelt in silent prayer. A few turned toward me, their eyes wide with desperation. I wanted to speak, to ask what this place was, but before I could form the words, Jesus spoke. His voice was not loud, yet it echoed all around me, reaching deep into the core of my being. He spoke of the days to come, a time of great trials, a choice, a mark would appear. Those who accepted it would lose something eternal. At first I didn't understand, but then he said, "The world is changing. You must warn them. They will be told they cannot live without it, but I will provide." His words echoed in my mind, shaking me to my very soul. What did he mean? Before I could ask, everything around me shifted. Jesus raised his hand again, and suddenly I was no longer standing in the vast landscape. I found myself in a completely different place, confronting an even more daunting situation. A vision, Earth, but not as I had known it. The world before me was darker, colder. The cities looked different, tightly controlled. I saw lines of people standing in eerie silence, their expressions blank, their eyes void of life. It was as if they had lost something deep within them, something irreplaceable. Jesus turned to look at me, and in that moment, I understood. This was the fate of those who had chosen the mark. This was the future that awaited them. I wanted to scream, to warn them before it was too late. But before I could move, Jesus reached out for me. The moment he touched me, everything shattered, as though an unstoppable force was pulling me away from the vision. I found myself falling backward. Gravity seized me once more, dragging me away from the vast unknown and back into the world I had left behind. And then I woke up. The descent began. Light and darkness swirled together, blending seamlessly as if I were falling through layers of existence. My senses were overwhelmed, my mind spinning in all directions, unable to keep up. I knew I was being returned, but was I truly ready? Then suddenly, I was back. A sharp gasp filled my lungs as air rushed into my chest. My fingers twitched, my vision blurred, and distant, urgent voices echoed around me. The neighbor who had found me was still there. Someone called my name in a panicked voice. I tried to sit up, but my body felt strange, foreign, as if I had been away from it for too long. The pain of existence crashed into me with every breath. Every movement burned, as if I were dragging my soul through heavy stone. But none of it compared to the weight of what I had just witnessed. Tears streamed down my cheeks as reality set in. I had died. I had met Jesus. I had received a message, a warning. But why? Why had I been allowed to return? A whisper stirred deep within me, an undeniable truth. I had not been sent back for myself. I had to speak. I had to tell the world what I had seen. Days passed, but I wrestled with the enormity of what had happened. My body remained weak, but my spirit was restless. The experience had profoundly shaken me, not only because I had transcended beyond death, but also because of the message Jesus had imparted to me. He had shown me the future, a future where people would be forced to make an impossible choice. Whatever the mark was, it would present itself as a necessity for survival. But it wasn't just about survival. It was about power. Those who accepted it would lose more than just their freedom. They would lose something eternal. I prayed for answers, for clarity. I needed to understand more. Then, one night, I had a dream. Jesus stood before me once again, his eyes, filled with sorrow and urgency, fixed on me. His voice was steady, yet heavy with grief. "Tell them," he said, "many will be misled into believing they have no choice, but I will provide." I woke with my heart pounding, tears streaming down my face. The message was clear. People needed to know. But how? Who would believe me? A former nun. How could I reach them? Yet in that moment, something deep within me stirred. A calling. An undeniable certainty. I didn't need to convince the world. All I had to do was convey the truth. Those who were meant to hear it would hear it. Even if only one person listened, it could change their fate. I had spent my entire life studying the Bible, praying, seeking God's wisdom. But after what I had seen, I realized how little I truly understood. The world was on the verge of something unprecedented. Most people were unprepared. In the vision, the mark was more than just a physical sign. It was a test of faith, of trust. It wouldn't be forced upon people outright. No, it would be presented as a solution. I saw government officials, even religious leaders. They would stand before the people, assuring them, "This is for your own good. Without it, you won't be able to buy or sell. This is the only way to survive." And far too many would believe them, except Jesus' words echoed in my heart. "They will believe they have no choice, but I do." That was the key. Those who refused the mark wouldn't have to suffer alone. God had already prepared a way, but only those who truly trusted him would find it. I knew most people wouldn't understand. Many would mock me, call me delusional, but that didn't matter. My mission wasn't to convince, it was to warn, because when the time came, those who remembered my words would know what to do. And that knowledge could save their souls. A quiet life of preparation. This became my purpose, not just for myself, but for those in need. When the time came, Jesus had taught me the true value of faith. So I established a community, one that relied not on the world's systems, but on God alone. We learned to live without modern conveniences, to grow our own food, and to sustain ourselves in ways I had never before considered. But most importantly, we prepared spiritually. Because the battle ahead would not be merely physical, it would be spiritual. And that would be the most powerful weapon used against humanity. I had seen it in the vision. Those who surrendered did not do so willingly. Instead of wanting it, they were afraid of hunger, isolation, and suffering. And yes, suffering did come. But those who stood firm were not abandoned. Miracles would occur, and doors would open where they appeared to be closed. God had provided for his people before. He would do so again. The question was, would people trust him? I had seen both sides of the future, the sorrow of those who gave in and the radiant strength of those who remained steadfast. The difference between them was not in their circumstances, but in their faith. That is why I share my story, not to instill fear, but to offer hope. Because when the time comes to make a choice, remember, Jesus has already made a way. You only need to trust him and follow it. After my experience, I kept asking myself, how would people survive if they refused the mark? It seemed impossible. Every aspect of life, the ability to buy, sell, or simply exist, was controlled. Those who did not comply were cut off from everything. But then I remembered Jesus' words, I will provide. The answer did not lie within the world system, but outside of it. Those who remained firm did not live in the cities. They did not rely on stores, banks, or government aid. Instead, they had learned to live differently. I saw hidden communities, small groups of believers who had prepared in advance. Some had fled to the wilderness, growing their own food and sharing resources. Others remained in the cities, living quietly, relying on underground support networks. And I saw miracles, food appearing where there should have been none, gardens flourishing in barren lands, water rising from dry ground. The sick are being healed without medicine. This was more than mere survival. It was divine protection. But faith was the key. Those who doubted, who allowed fear to consume them, struggled. They hesitated, and in their hesitation, they surrendered. Jesus showed me many things, but one of the scariest was what would happen to people after they accepted the mark. At first, it seemed harmless, a simple procedure, a choice made in desperation, believing it was just another step forward in modern society. But once accepted, something inside them changed, not immediately. At first, there was relief. They could buy food, travel, and live without fear. But over time, something faded. Their eyes lost their brightness. Their emotions dulled. They no longer questioned, no longer resisted. They became obedient, not just in action, but in thought. I saw families torn apart, a husband who no longer recognized his wife because she had not taken it, a mother who had accepted it and no longer felt love for her children. The bond between them, once unbreakable, was severed, as if a piece of their soul had died. Jesus' sorrow was deep as he revealed the truth. They had chosen the world. Jesus looked upon me with sorrow and said that the world had claimed them. It was more than just a physical mark. It was an act of spiritual submission. And once the choice was made, there was no turning back. That was why the decision mattered so much. It wasn't only about survival. It was about the eternal soul. After returning to my body, my perception of Scripture changed. Prophecies I had once viewed as symbolic now appeared in a stark and undeniable light, painfully real. I recalled the warnings in Revelation, and he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark. Revelation 13:16-17. For years, scholars and believers had debated what this meant. Some said it referred to technology, others to government mandates, or even a religious decree. But after my experience, I understood. It was all of those things and more. It was a test. The test of loyalty would distinguish those who trusted God from those who trusted the world. I delved into history, studying the trials of believers who had faced persecution before us. The early Christians were forced to choose between worshiping Roman gods or facing death. The persecuted church had always been given a choice. The pattern had existed since the beginning, and soon it would emerge again, but this time on a scale the world had never seen. That was why Jesus sent me back, not to frighten people, but to remind them that this was not just a political conflict or a technological system of control. This was a spiritual struggle only those who remained steadfast in faith would endure. The visions, the warnings, and the overwhelming presence of Jesus all led to one undeniable truth, a call to prepare. But preparation was more than stockpiling food and seeking shelter. It was more than finding a safe place to hide. The true preparation was within. Jesus did not reveal these things to terrify me. He showed them so that people could strengthen their faith before the storm arrived. Because when the time came, hesitation would be dangerous. I saw it. Those who believed they had time, who said, "I'll decide when it happens," were unprepared. And when the moment came, the pressure was too great. The fear overwhelmed them, and they fell. The ones who stood firm weren't always the strongest or the most intelligent. They were the ones who had already decided. They had erected their faith like a stronghold, steadfast and unyielding. So my message is simple. Choose now. Decide where you stand before the world forces you to make a choice. Grow your faith. Learn to live outside the system. Surround yourself with people who will stand with you. And above all, trust Jesus, because that trust will be your anchor in the days to come. It will be the difference between falling into darkness and walking in light. After my return, I often wondered who would truly stand when the time came. And Jesus showed me something unexpected. It would not always be the ones I assumed. It would not be those who were religious by routine alone. Not those who attended church yet never truly surrendered their hearts. Not those who spoke of faith but clung to the comforts of the world. Instead, those who would stand were those who had already died to themselves. In my vision, I saw men and women from every race, young and old, from every background. They were not the wealthiest, the most powerful, or the most educated, but their faith was unshakable. Some had been preparing for years. Others had awakened only in the final moments, but none of them bowed. Even though it cost them everything, These people had one thing in common, an unshakable faith in God. They knew they were never truly alone. Even in hunger, He would provide food. Even in danger, He would be their refuge. Even in death, He would not abandon them. The question now is, will you be among them? In my vision, Jesus showed me something chilling. A line was drawn. On one side stood those who had chosen the world. They accepted the mark, believing they were securing their future. They thought they were making the logical choice, the safe choice. On the other side stood those who refused. They were mocked, labeled as foolish, paranoid, or extremists. Many lost their jobs, their homes, and their place in society. Some were hunted, imprisoned, or faced even worse consequences. But the true separation was far deeper than just the physical. I saw a shift in the souls of those who had taken the mark. At first, they seemed unchanged, simply relieved to return to a normal life. But over time, something within them hardened. Their hearts became closed to spiritual truth. Their ability to question, to discern, to feel deeply faded. Their sacred relationship with God was severed, not by force, but by their own choice. In contrast, those who refused the mark were like stars shining in the night. Even in suffering, they radiated peace. Even in hunger, they found food. Even when the world abandoned them, God did not. Everyone will choose, Jesus said to me. There will be no neutrality, no middle ground. No one will be able to avoid the decision. At the core of it all, the question remains, whom do you trust more, the world or God? The great separation is not coming. It has already begun. My heart is heavy, not out of fear, but because I see so many people still asleep. They believe they have time. I once thought the same. I thought faith was something to lean on in difficult times, a source of comfort when life became uncertain. I did not realize it was the only thing that truly mattered. Jesus did not show me these things so that I would keep them to myself. He sent me back to warn you. The time is running out. I don't know how long we have, but the world is changing faster than we comprehend. Systems designed to control people are being built right before our eyes. Deception is spreading, but there is hope. There is always hope. Before I returned, Jesus gave me a final message. It was simple. Tell them I am coming, and I believe him. So, this is my message to you. Prepare now. Strengthen your faith. Put your trust in God. Surround yourself with those who will stand firm. Stop depending on the world. It will betray you. The coming days will not be easy, but we were chosen to live in this time for a reason. And for those who do not give up, there is a promise, a kingdom greater than anything this world could ever offer. You have a choice, but you must make it now, because soon there will be no more time to decide. Not with fear, but with relief. In my vision, the world had already been through a devastating collapse, economic chaos, disasters, wars. Everything people once relied on was gone. They were desperate for stability, for security, for something, anything to hold on to. Thus, a new system came into existence, a system designed not just to restore order, but to demand allegiance. When it was first introduced, it was presented as a solution, not a means of control. Leaders stood before the people, speaking with confidence, assuring them that the suffering would soon end and that a new era of stability was beginning. They promised safety. They promised prosperity. They promised peace. But it was all a lie. As the new system went into effect, I saw crowds cheering and celebrating. The mark was more than just a necessity. It was a symbol of honor. Those who accepted it were praised. They were given access to food, shelter, and employment, everything they needed to survive. The world told them they were part of something greater, that they were moving forward together. And then I saw those who refused. They weren't viewed as individuals making a personal choice. They were seen as obstacles to progress. The news labeled them as extremists, as dangerous individuals standing in the way of a better future. Friends who once stood by them turned away. Families disowned them. Society rejected them. But what shocked me the most was how easily the world embraced this division. Those who had taken the mark no longer questioned anything. They did not stop to wonder why their neighbors, people they once cared about, were now treated as outcasts. Their minds had been consumed by deception. Yet, in the midst of it all, I noticed something else. Scattered among the chaos were pockets of believers, standing firm, unshaken. They knew what was coming. They had prepared their hearts. The false peace was only for those who conformed, but the real peace, that belonged to those who remained faithful. The battle was just beginning. At first, those who refused the mark were not actively pursued. They were simply cut off. In my vision, I saw a woman standing in a grocery store. Her children were beside her, their faces pale with hunger. Her hands trembled as she picked up a loaf of bread and walked to the counter. She tried to pay, but the system no longer accepted cash. The cashier looked at her with sympathy, but rules were rules. "I'm sorry," he said, gesturing toward the scanner. Tears welled in her eyes. She clutched the bread, knowing her children hadn't eaten in days. And then, slowly, she shook her head. She turned and walked away, empty-handed. That was how it began. At first, those without the mark were simply denied access. They couldn't buy food. They couldn't receive medical care. They couldn't travel. They were told it was their choice. They had rejected the system, so they had to live with the consequences. But as time passed, the restrictions grew harsher. Stories spread. Stories meant to instill fear. The unmarked were painted as a threat. Governments passed laws forbidding them from entering public spaces. The world turned against them completely. I saw a man who had once been respected, a doctor who had dedicated his life to saving others, but he refused the mark. Consequently, they revoked his medical license. He was labeled irresponsible and unfit to practice. I saw young people cast out of their homes by their own families, left with nowhere to go, no place to belong, no way to survive. And then the next phase began. At first, compliance was not forced. It was encouraged. Those without the mark were relocated for their own well-being. That was what the authorities called it. The unmarked were taken to special camps where they were given the opportunity to reconsider. But I saw what really happened inside. They lost everything, their possessions, their dignity, their freedom. Under relentless pressure, many broke. Some gave in, taking the mark just to escape the suffering. But others stood firm, and for them, the world had something else in store. Only one answer remained. It eliminated Jesus, revealing the final group, the last remnant, those who refused to bow to the system. They had endured everything: starvation, persecution, and exile. They had lost their homes, their families, even their very names. Yet, through it all, their faith had only grown stronger. They weren't just hiding in the wilderness or running from the system. They had learned to live completely outside of it. I saw small, hidden communities forming in remote places, untouched by the world's control. They were self-sufficient, relying on neither technology nor government provisions. And despite every effort to cut them off, they thrived. Food grew where none should have. Water appeared in the driest places. The sick were healed without medicine. These weren't just acts of survival. They were miracles. I saw it with my own eyes. A young girl, barely 10 years old, knelt beside a sick man. The doctors had said there was no cure. As she applied her hands to him and prayed, he experienced instant healing. I saw an elderly woman kneeling in the dirt, crying out to God for food. Moments later, a stranger arrived, carrying bread. "I don't know why," he said, "but something told me to bring this here." Jesus' words echoed in my heart, "I will provide." But then the ultimate test arrived. The world had been searching for these believers, desperate to control them. To the system, they were the final resistance, the last challenge to its total authority. I saw soldiers marching toward one of the hidden camps. They carried weapons, but they also carried something far more dangerous: deception. A man in a crisp suit stepped forward, smiling. "We don't want to hurt you," he said. "We only want you to join us. It will make your life so much easier." The believers stood in silence. No one moved. Then the man played his final trick. He gestured toward the children. "Think of them," he said softly. "Do you really want them to suffer?" The silence became unbearable. Finally, an elderly man stepped forward. His face was lined with age, his hands scarred by time. His voice was steady. "You cannot take what does not belong to you," he said. "Our souls are not for sale." The man in the suit sighed. "So be it," he said coldly. He turned to the soldiers and gave the order. The believers were surrounded. Some were taken away, never to be seen again. The rest were given one last chance to accept the mark. None of them did. Then suddenly the sky opened. A great light, brighter than the sun, descended upon them. The soldiers fell to the ground, shielding their faces in fear. But the believers stood tall, and in an instant, everything changed. Those who had remained faithful were lifted up, taken from their suffering, and transported to a place beyond this world. Those who had chosen the world were left behind, and as the vision ended, they realized, too late, what they had done. The message was clear: stand firm. The world will tempt you, pressure you, try to break you. But if you trust in God, He will deliver you. This is why I was sent, not to frighten you, but to prepare you. I pray that when the time comes, you will be among those who stand until the end. Because when Jesus returns, everything will change.